The snow had been falling for 11 days straight. Mara Voss knew this because she had marked it on the wall. 11 small scratches in the plaster. Beside the kitchen window, each one made at first light when she could see the storm was still going. She did it every morning now, had done it for 3 years. Not because it mattered. The scratches didn't tell her anything she couldn't already feel in her bones. She did it because it was something to do. Because the sound of metal on plaster was the only sound in the apartment that didn't belong to the cold, or the dark, or the slow, patient creaking of a building that had been empty too long. Outside, through the frost-thickened glass, the town of Vela spread out in white silence. 2 rows of apartment blocks facing each other across a street that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Buried under 3 feet of permanent snowpack, the surface occasionally broken by the shape of an abandoned car, a toppled lamppost, the rusted cab of a truck that had been left running when whoever was driving it decided running was more important than the truck. The buildings on the far side had their windows sealed with plywood or frozen fabric or, in one case, the bodies of the things that had come through them. That one had happened 2 winters ago. Mara had watched from her window. She had not looked away. She had thought about going over there, after. She had thought about it for 3 days, crouched in the cold kitchen with her knees against her chest and her rifle across her thighs, working through the geometry of it. Which door? Which route? How many seconds of exposure in the open street, whether whatever was inside was still inside or had moved on. In the end, she hadn't gone, not because of the things, because of Daniel. Daniel was still asleep. He slept until 9 now, sometimes later, which was a change from the first winter when fear had made them both early risers, both of them awake before dawn and moving through the apartment in the gray half-light like ghosts who had forgotten how to haunt. Sleep had been a resource then, a rationed thing, something you grabbed in 2-hour chunks between watches. Now he slept like a stone, like someone had wrapped him in lead and dropped him into the deepest part of himself, and she let him. There was no reason not to. The days had grown long and formless, and sleep was the only thing that moved through them at any real speed. She made coffee. There was enough of the real stuff left for maybe 6 more weeks if she was careful, after which she would move to the chicory substitute that Daniel had found in the back of the sporting goods store on Craner Street during last summer's foraging run. She had tasted it once. She would need the real shortage to be very real before she drank it again. The coffee was hot, and she stood at the window with both hands around the mug and looked out at the snow and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she had developed out of necessity. You could not live in the silence with a busy mind. She had learned that in the first months, when her thoughts had run in loops, her sister in Prague, her mother's apartment in Brno, colleagues she had not heard from, a dozen small and ordinary losses that had stacked up into something enormous. You had to learn to empty yourself, to let the white nothing outside come in and take up residence. The Buddhists had been onto something, she thought. They had just needed a plague and an alien invasion to make it land properly. She almost smiled at that. Almost. The thought arrived the way they always did when she was too relaxed. Sideways, through the gap, she set the coffee down and pressed her forehead against the cold glass and looked across at the dark buildings. The things hadn't come in 11 days, hadn't come in the 23 days before that either. The gaps between visits were getting longer, and she couldn't decide whether that was good or terrible. She had asked Daniel about it once, and he had said it was good. Obviously. What else would it be? And she had said she didn't know. She just felt like the gaps meant something, and he had looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her when she said things like that, and she had let it go. She heard him wake up. She always heard him. The apartment was only 4 rooms, 2 of them unusable since the winter before last when the outer wall of the bedroom had cracked from the cold, and they had sealed it off and moved the mattresses into the living room. She heard the shift of weight, the specific creak of the middle floorboard that he always managed to hit no matter which route he took, the sound of water from the hand pump over the sink. They had a good water situation. That was one thing. The building had a backup cistern in the basement that fed by gravity from the rooftop collector, and as long as it snowed regularly, the collector stayed full. In 3 years, the water had only failed twice, both times in summer, both times resolved within a week. She picked up her coffee and turned from the window. He came out of the back room in 2 layers of thermal, and the wool socks she had mended 3 times now, and he looked at her and then at the window and then at her again. "Still snowing," he said. "Since day 3. She held up her mug. Coffee? Yeah. He dropped into the chair by the stove and pulled his knees up and looked at his hands. He did that a lot, looked at his hands. She had noticed it starting about 6 months in, and by now it was simply part of the landscape of him, like the scar on his chin or the way he exhaled through his teeth when he was worried. He was 41 years old and he looked it, which was not an insult. He looked like a man who had earned every year. The beard helped with the look. She had asked him once why he kept it, and he had said because shaving seemed like a lot of effort for a world that wasn't going to notice either way. And she had said fair enough. His name was Daniel Kraus. Before the world ended, he had been a structural engineer, which had turned out to be extremely useful in the new world. He could look at a building and tell you in about 3 minutes whether it was going to fall on you, whether the floor above the basement would hold a loaded sled, whether the roof was load-bearing or decorative. He had grown up in this part of the country, knew the terrain, knew which buildings in Vela had been built in the 70s with the right specifications and which had been thrown up in the 90s with whatever was cheap. He had chosen this building himself. The walls were thick. The boiler in the basement was heavy fuel and pre-digital, which mattered. It mattered because of what the things did to electronics. She poured him coffee and brought it over, and sat on the edge of the mattress nearest the stove, and they drank in silence for a while, which was comfortable now. Had not always been. The first 6 months with Daniel had been like sharing a space with a weather system. Moods that moved in from nowhere, silences that were made of pressure rather than peace, arguments that flared and died and left a residue. Not because they were bad people or incompatible, because they had both been through a version of the same thing, and they had each handled it in a way that made the other one nervous. She had gone inward. He had gone angry. Neither one was the wrong response to watching the world end, but they had taken a while to find the edges of each other. Now they were. She didn't have a word for it, not in love in any romantic sense, not the way people meant that in the time before. Something older than that. Something that lived in the sounds of another person breathing in the dark, in the knowledge of how they took their coffee, in the specific weight of their presence in a room. She trusted him with her life because he had earned it, specifically and repeatedly. He trusted her back, she thought, she hoped. "I want to go to the hardware store today," Daniel said. She looked at him over her mug. "The one on Marta Street," he said. "I've been thinking about the east wall. If this weather keeps up, that crack in the lower panel is going to spread, and if it spreads into the load-bearing section, I know about the crack. Then you know we need expanding foam and probably 2 sections of timber if I can find them." He met her eyes. "I can go by myself." "You're not going by yourself. It's been 34 days since we saw any sign of them. I know how many days it's been." Then, 34 days was also true the day before we saw the prints on Vogler Street. She set her mug down. "The gap doesn't mean anything. Daniel, I've thought about it. The gap is just the gap." He didn't argue, which was something. 2 years ago he would have argued. Now he just looked at his hands again for a moment, and then nodded once, and she felt the familiar, complicated mix of gratitude and grief. Grateful because he had learned to trust her instincts. Grieved because it had taken so much to teach him. Grieved because she remembered the specific lessons, the ones that had names. "Tomorrow," she said. "If the snow eases, we go together early and we're back inside before noon. The hardware store and nowhere else." Agreed. "And we check the perimeter first." Agreed. She picked up her mug. Outside, the snow kept falling, patient and indifferent, burying the street another centimeter deeper. Somewhere far off in the white middle distance, a building settled under its own weight with a sound like a breath let out. They had been living in Vela for 2 years and 7 months. Before Vela there had been the road. Before the road there had been the city. Before the city there had been the before time, which neither of them talked about directly anymore, but which was always present in the room with them like a third person who never spoke. The before time had ended in the first week of June, 3 years ago, when the ships came. She had been in a conference room in Brno when it happened. She remembered the light first. Not the ships, not an alarm, just the light coming through the conference room windows going suddenly wrong. The quality of it shifting in a way that she couldn't name immediately, like a filter laid over the sky. She had stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked up and seen the shape against the clouds. One of her colleagues had said something behind her. She couldn't remember what. And then someone else had said, "Oh God." And then no one had said anything at all. The first ship was the size of a city block. That was the comparison everyone used later. when there was still a later and people were still making comparisons. City block, aircraft carrier, small mountain. The scales all felt wrong because the scales you had available were the wrong kind. You kept reaching for human measurements, and the thing kept exceeding them in ways that made the measurement feel insulting. It had been in the sky above the Spielberg district, motionless, dark against the clouds, shaped like something between an eye and a fist. By the time the second one appeared over the river district, she was already in the stairwell. By the time she reached the street, there were 6. They had not communicated, had not broadcast demands or ultimatums or any of the things that human fiction had prepared the species for. No signal decoded by a brilliant scientist, no countdown, no representative landing in a field with an outstretched limb. What they had done, within 40 minutes of their first appearance, was deploy the things. Nobody had a good name for them. The media, in the 3 days before the media stopped functioning, had tried several. Harvesters, revenants, the Pale, none of them stuck. Partly because by the time you were in a position to hear a name you were usually running, and names stopped mattering. In the 2 years since, Mara and Daniel had settled on the word "the things." It was specific enough. There was nothing else in the world anymore that warranted that particular article and that particular word. The things were the things. Everything else was just everything else. They were bipedal, which had surprised everyone who survived long enough to study them. You expected alien to mean radically different in form, extra limbs, no limbs, something that moved through air or liquid in a way that defied vertebrate architecture. The things walked upright. They had 2 arms and 2 legs and a head where a head should be. For the first 20 minutes, this had caused enormous, fatal hesitation in anyone who encountered them, because the silhouette at distance in poor light looked nearly human, and human beings were not, it turned out, capable of overriding 300,000 years of social processing in 20 minutes, just because someone on the radio said the things on the street were not people. Close up, there was no confusion. The skin was wrong, gray-white, dense, more like the hide of something aquatic than anything terrestrial, smooth in a way that made light slide off it rather than absorb. The face was wrong. The proportions were nearly right, but the features were inverted. The sensory organs clustered low, the cranium enormous. The overall effect of something that had studied a human face in poor light and reproduced it from memory, getting the pieces right but the arrangement slightly off. They did not have eyes in any conventional sense. Whatever they used to navigate with, whatever took in information and processed it, it wasn't visible. They moved like they could see in all directions at once. They were fast. That was the thing people remembered most who had seen them and lived. Not how large they were, not the sound they made, not the way the air changed temperature in their proximity. The speed. The specific wrongness of something that large, moving that fast, moving with no wind-up, no preparation, no physical tell that anything was about to happen, and then simply being somewhere else, while the place it had been was already 10 meters behind. And they had evolved. That was the thing that kept Mara awake on certain nights when the scratches on the wall were too few, and the gaps between visits too long. They had evolved in the 3 years since deployment. She had read the papers during the first months when the network was still partially functioning, fragmentary things, uploaded to mirrors and amateur archives from researchers who had somehow kept working, kept writing, kept appending data to shared drives from somewhere in the wreckage. The early things had been apex predators, but not especially clever ones, driven by heat and movement, avoidable if you were very cold and very still. The things that came now were different. They had learned the smell of cook fires. They had learned what it meant when a building was structurally compromised versus structurally sound. The sound it made when weight was applied, the specific frequency of human activity through floors and walls. They had learned to wait. She thought about them waiting now as she looked out the window at the snow. Somewhere in the white geometry of the town, maybe. Or farther out, in the forest where the road ran north. Waiting with the specific patience of things that did not experience time the way she did, for whom the 34-day gap between appearances was not an absence, but a breath held. She made herself stop thinking about it and went to see about breakfast. The thing about staying alive in the long term. The thing nobody said in the first weeks, because in the first week's long term was 48 hours, was that it was mostly logistical. You were managing a set of resources and risks across time, and the skill was not bravery or marksmanship or the ability to perform under pressure, though those things helped. The skill was accounting. The skill was sitting down with a pencil and a piece of paper and going through, one more time, what you had and what it cost and how long that gave you and what the next choke point was. Mara had been good at this before. In the before time, she had worked in disaster risk management for a provincial emergency services agency, had spent her career doing exactly this kind of analysis for floods and fires and epidemics, building the models that told you how bad it could get and where the leverage points were. She had been considered good at her job. She had won an award once. She found this darkly funny sometimes, the specificity of her preparation for exactly this. Daniel, when she had explained her job in the first weeks, had said, "So you spent your career planning for the end of the world?" And she had said, "I planned for provincial floods, Daniel," and he had said, "Same skill set, different scale." And she had found that she couldn't disagree. They ate oatmeal with dried fruit from the last of the preservation jars, and she noted in the ledger that they were down to 7 jars of the cherries and 4 of the apricots, and that if the spring run was successful there would be fresh fruit again in 4 months. But that depended on the spring run being successful, which depended on the spring which she had learned not to count on in advance. "I've been thinking about the roof," Daniel said. "The snow load. If we get another week of this without a freeze-thaw cycle, we're going to be looking at structural stress on the eastern parapet. Can you reinforce it from inside? With the right materials, yes. That's part of why I want the hardware store." He looked at her. "I know you're cautious about the timing. I'm not cautious. I'm right." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. "You're right about most things," he said. "It's genuinely irritating. 34 days is not a long gap. It's a medium gap. The longest gap we've ever had was 41 days, and then they came 3 nights running. I remember." She knew he remembered. He had a scar on his left forearm from the 3rd of those 3 nights. It had healed badly and left a ridge of tissue that he rubbed sometimes, without seeming to notice. She watched him rub it now. "Tomorrow," she said again, "early, together, we'll move fast." "Okay," he said. And then, "Thank you." She looked up. "For all of it," he said. He was looking at his oatmeal, for being right most of the time. He stopped. "I'm bad at this. I know. I was worse at it before. I know that too." She thought about the before-time version of him, assembled from the pieces she had gathered over 3 years. Fragments, mentions, the shape of something that had happened that he was still carrying. There had been someone else. A woman, he'd said once, briefly, carefully. A child. He hadn't elaborated and she hadn't asked and she would never ask. You learned in this life to treat certain silences like structures with load-bearing walls. You learned the difference between the ones you could open up and the ones that would bring everything down. She cleared the bowls and went to check the perimeter alarms. They were simple things, strung wire and bell weights on the lower windows, a pressure board across the basement entrance, 2 motion-sensitive rattles she had constructed from cans and fishing line on the exterior, windowsills of the 1st floor. None of it would stop the things. She was realistic about that. The purpose was not to stop them. The purpose was to buy 30 seconds. In 30 seconds, you could get to the roof hatch. In 30 seconds from the roof hatch, you could reach the fire escape on the north face. And from the fire escape, you could get to the connecting roof of the neighboring building, and from there to the access door that she had picked and relocked with their own key. The whole route had been walked so many times in the dark that her body knew it. She could do it blind and half asleep. She knew because she had, once, in the 2nd winter, when the alarm had gone off at 2 in the morning and she had gone from dead asleep to moving through darkness without a single conscious thought, just the body's knowledge of where the walls were and where the roof hatch was and what came next. The things had been in the building for 11 minutes. When she and Daniel had come back through the south entrance the next morning, there had been nothing left of the ground floor apartments worth grieving over. She had looked at it for a long time and filed it in the section of herself where she kept the information that was necessary but not survivable too. Think about directly. All the alarms were intact. She stood for a moment in the stairwell and listened. The building sounds, the specific vocabulary of it, the groan of the heating pipes, the tick of the west wall contracting in the cold, the faint percussion of the wind against the sealed windows. She had memorized all of it, the way you memorized a person's body language, so that anything new would be obvious, would stand out against the familiar. Nothing, just the building breathing. She went back up. They spent the afternoon doing what they always spent afternoons doing, which was maintenance. There was always maintenance. The work of staying alive in a place that was slowly losing its fight against entropy was endless and precise. The boiler needed regular checks. The water pressure system needed purging every 3 weeks. The food stores needed rotation and re-inventory. The weapons needed cleaning. The books of their lives needed keeping. Mara patched 2 sections of the insulating liner on the north wall with material she had cut from a camping sleeping bag. Daniel spent 3 hours on the boiler, lying on the cold floor of the basement with a flashlight in his teeth and his arm in a space that was too small for his arm, adjusting the fuel intake valve that had been running slightly rich since December. She brought him coffee halfway through. He reached out a hand for it without looking up, and she put the mug into it and stood there for a while, watching him work. He was good with his hands. She had noticed this early on, and it still struck her, not as attraction exactly, or not only as attraction, but as a kind of reassurance. The way watching someone do something skillfully always contained some comfort. He worked with economy, no wasted motion, the hand going to exactly where it needed to be without searching. She had seen him do structural assessments of buildings he had never been in, running his hands along joints and corners with the same economy, and she had thought, this is what expertise looks like in a body, not confidence, specificity. He knew where to look. The boiler was fixed by 4. They ate dinner early, dried pasta with the last of the jarred tomato sauce, and sat by the stove with the light failing fast outside, and talked about what they needed from the hardware store and how long it would take, and the optimal route there and back. She had a map of Vela that she kept updated. Streets she had confirmed clear, buildings she had confirmed stable, the locations of every cache and supply point she had established in a 2-kilometer radius. She spread it on the table between them, and they traced the route with their fingers in the lamplight. If we go down Marta Street, we pass the school, she said. I know. The school has a compromised south wall. If anything happens and we need to move fast, we can't go through it. We go around it, through the park. The park has line of sight issues. Too many places to be unseen from. Versus a compromised structure. The structure is known. We know where the wall is, and we know not to stand under it. She looked up. Unknown cover beats known hazard, Daniel. Always. He looked at the map for a moment. Agreed, he said, the park. She had learned something about this, about the way decisions got made between 2 people under sustained pressure. There was a version of it that was corrosive, where the accumulated weight of bad decisions and close calls turned every discussion into a negotiation of blame. She had seen it happen to others in the first year, in the groups they had briefly passed through before the groups fell apart. 2 people who had once trusted each other, wearing away at the trust, through small failures and smaller resentments, until there was nothing left but the habit of presence. She had watched it and filed it and made a private commitment. They would never do that. She would never let herself build a case. Whatever frustration she felt in the moment, she would let it be in the moment and not carry it forward. It had not always been easy. There were nights, there were days of silence that were the wrong kind of silence. But they had held. She folded the map and put it away. Outside, the snow had stopped. The air through the sealed window had that specific stillness that came after. Heavy snowfall, the white absorption of all ambient sound. And she stood for a while in the kitchen and looked at the sky, which had cleared to reveal a scatter of stars she never saw when the snow was falling. She identified Orion by habit. Her father had taught her the constellations when she was 7, lying on the grass in the garden of the house she had grown up in, his hand warm under her head. She had not thought about that in months. She thought about it now, briefly and carefully, and put it away again. She went to bed. She woke at 3 to the sound of the rattle on the east window. One sound, clear, distinct, the specific metallic shiver of the rattle against the windowsill frame. She was out of the sleeping bag before she was fully conscious. Rifle in her hand, the action of waking and arming so practiced that it preceded thought by half a second. She reached across and put her hand on Daniel's shoulder and pressed, one firm press, and felt him come awake instantly. He had always been a fast waker. It was one of the things she was grateful for, and she held up 2 fingers and pointed at the east wall, and he nodded and was out of his bag in one movement. No lights. She moved through the apartment from memory, left 3 steps from the mattress, pause at the kitchen door, right, across the kitchen floor, avoiding the loose board at the center, to the window, her back against the wall beside it, not in front of it. She tilted her head and looked with one eye past the edge of the frame. The street below was white and still. The snow caught what light there was, ambient starlight, the thin blue glow of a sky without clouds, and threw it back in a flat, even illumination that was not bright but was enough. She could see the shape of the car on the far side, the line of the building opposite, the drifts against the curb. She could see the place on the street where the rattle hung on the outside of the window, the thin cord, the can at the end of it. The cord was swinging, very slowly, the specific slow pendulum of something that had been nudged and was now completing its arc. The street was empty. She held very still and looked at the other windows and the deep shadows of the doorways and the space under the car in the corner of the building at the end of the street. Nothing moved. She waited 4 minutes. In 4 minutes, your eyes adjusted as much as they were going to, and the cold air came through the hair-thin gaps in the window seal, and she could feel her breath slowing back toward normal and her hands going from grip to hold. She cataloged what she could see. Nothing. The cord had stilled. The street was empty. She moved back to Daniel. East rattle, she breathed. Not even a whisper. The subvocal register. 1 hit? 1 hit. Cord still moving when I got there. Wind? No wind. It stopped after the snow. You know how it goes. She felt rather than saw him nod. He knew how it went. Could be debris, he said. Snow falling from the overhang. Could be, but you don't think so. She thought about the arc of the cord, the specific angle of a pendulum that had been struck from the east, not dropped on from above. No, she said. The roof hatch? Not yet. 1 rattle isn't enough to break routine. She put her hand on his arm in the dark. Back to bed, staggered watch. You take first. He took her hand briefly, squeezed, let go. Okay. She lay down on the sleeping bag in her clothes and her boots and did not sleep. She watched the ceiling in the dark and listened to Daniel move quietly through the apartment on watch and listened to the building and to the street outside and to the specific texture of the silence which had not changed. At 5:30 he came and touched her arm and she was up. She watched for 2 hours while he slept. Nothing moved. Nothing came. The street remained empty and the cord remained still, and the stars wheeled slowly to morning. They went to the hardware store at 8. The route she had planned took them south on Bower Street, west through the small square by the defunct fountain, and then north again on Marta, the school on their left, at a prudent distance, the park giving them cover on the right. She walked point with the rifle and he walked behind with the bolt action he had found in the sporting goods store in the first winter, and they moved the way they always moved outside. Measured pace, constant scanning, heads on a swivel, never both looking in the same direction at once. The snow was fresh and untouched on Bower Street. This was one of the things she read, the snow. Fresh snow remembered everything. Every foot and paw and dragging weight left its signature. She read Bower Street's surface carefully as they moved and found nothing she hadn't expected. The drifts against the wall of the old drugstore, the place where the roof of the print shop had finally shed its load sometime in the night, the avalanche of snow piled in a cone against the building's east face, the tracks of a fox that had crossed the square sometime before the last snowfall. Nothing else. They crossed the square quickly, open ground, no cover, 30 seconds of exposure at a medium pace. She counted internally, and they made it in 28. Marta Street opened up ahead of them, wider, the school building's dark brick face visible at the far end. She stopped them at the corner and spent a full minute looking before she moved. The street was clear. The school building's compromised wall had not progressed further into collapse. The crack she had documented in November was still at the same extent, which was information. The hardware store was 3 buildings down on the left, a low commercial building with a rolled-down security shutter on the front that they had long since forced and re-secured with their own padlock. She had the key. They reached it in 30 seconds, and she unlocked the padlock while Daniel covered the street. And then they were inside in the dim interior smell of sawdust and machine oil and rust, pulling the shutter closed behind them. She allowed herself one breath of the familiar smell, allowed herself to feel the small, tight loosening of tension that came from being inside and covered. 20 minutes, she said. 20 minutes. He agreed, and moved toward the timber section. She took the near aisles, the fasteners and sealants, moving quickly but quietly through the organized dark. She had a mental list, had been keeping it for 3 weeks, expanding foam, a box of long screws, replacement wicks for the oil lamps. She found the foam quickly, found the screws, found the wicks in a cardboard box at the end of aisle 4. She took 2 extra boxes of the screws and a handful of replacement cutting blades for the handsaw. She found a roll of heavy gauge wire that she hadn't expected and took it because wire was always useful. She found 3 jars of wood preservative that made no practical sense to carry. But she took them anyway because there was a part of her that still planned for a future in which wood things needed preserving. She was at the counter, loading items into the bag, when she heard Daniel stop moving. The specific quality of a person stopping, not reaching the end of an aisle, not pausing to look at something. The complete stillness that had a different sound than motion, because motion had a sound you didn't notice until it wasn't there. She did not call out. She turned her head slowly toward where he had been and listened. Silence. She put down the bag. She brought the rifle up. She moved along the wall of the store toward the timber section, staying low, using the shelving for cover while keeping her sight lines open. The timber section was at the back, a high-ceilinged space where the plywood and boards were racked in vertical slots. She came around the end of the shelving and found Daniel standing 6 feet inside the section, completely still, looking up. She followed his eyes. There was a hole in the ceiling, not a structural failure, not collapsed. A hole, roughly circular, maybe a meter across, the edges pressed outward and downward, the snow from outside visible in the gray light coming through it. The edges of the hole had been pushed, not broken. As if something had moved through it from the outside, coming down, pressing the material away from itself rather than breaking it. Something very heavy, something very large. She looked at Daniel. He looked at her. His face was the specific blank of controlled fear, the kind where you have already used up your reaction and are running on the pure clear bandwidth of trained response. She pointed 2 fingers at the hole and then at the floor beneath it, the specific question, how long ago? He held up 1 finger, then curled it down slowly. Less than 1 minute. He had been on this side of the store when it happened. She scanned the room. The timber racks were tall enough to conceal something. The shadows between them were deep. She pointed at the far end of the section and made the move signal with a flat hand, and he moved, and she covered the space above and behind them, and they reached the end of the section in 4 steps. And she checked the alley between the last rack and the wall, and it was clear, and she pressed her back against the wall and looked at the hole from the side. Nothing moved through it. The light coming down from it was gray and steady. They did not speak. She held up 3 fingers and he nodded and she counted them down, and on 0 they moved to the side entrance, the door in the east wall she had identified on the first visit, and she pushed the bar and they were outside in the cold and moving. She moved them north instead of south. Directly north, away from the school, away from the planned route, north and then east in a wide arc that kept them away from the line of approach toward their building. Not home, not yet. You did not go home directly if something had been in close proximity. You described an arc. You made sure you were not being followed. You gave it time. Took them 40 minutes. She held them in a rooftop doorway on Schiller Street for 20 minutes, watching the street below, before she was satisfied to have enough to move. Daniel did not question it. He had learned specifically and repeatedly not to question it. They reached home at 11:15. She locked the shutter, reset the perimeter alarm at the front entrance, and stood in the dark stairwell for a full minute before she let herself breathe. It was in there with us, Daniel said. Yes. When I stopped moving, I could. He stopped. I could hear it, between the racks. Something breathing. Something that didn't sound like any. He stopped again. I know, the hole was fresh. Yes, it came down through the roof, which means it was on the roof, which means it had been following the roof line. She had been doing the same calculation, which means it knew we were inside before it came through the ceiling. Silence. It was waiting for us to. He stopped. To be enclosed, she said. Yes. She held the bag of supplies and looked at the wall of the stairwell in the dark. The expanding foam, the screws, the wire. They learn, she said. You've said that. I know what I've said. I'm saying it again. She turned and looked at him, and in the darkness she could just see shape of his face. They learned, Daniel. This one knew we were there. It was going to come down, and it was going to do it when we were in a space where we couldn't maneuver. That is not hunting behavior. That is, she stopped, the word she needed just out of reach. Strategy, he said, yes. The word sat between them in the cold stairwell. She had thought about this for 3 years. In the intermittent quiet spaces between the immediate demands of survival. She had read what she could find in the fractured archive of the old internet, the papers and reports and amateur observations uploaded by people who were probably dead now, building as complete a picture as she could of what the things were and how they worked, and whether there was any pattern to their behavior that could be exploited. She had built a model in her head, A damage assessment the way she had been trained to do. Here is the threat. Here are its characteristics. Here are the constraints it operates under. Here is where it is most and least able to cause harm. And she had arrived 3 years in at a picture she found genuinely frightening. Not because of what it showed about the things, but because of what it implied about the direction of travel. They were getting smarter, not in the way that individual animals learned, not the rat that pressed a lever and associated it with food, not the crow that remembered a face. Something larger, something collective, as if what they learned in one encounter was being added to a shared body of knowledge about human behavior. The gaps between visits getting longer, not because they were retreating, she thought now, but because they were learning to wait for the right moment, coming when the situation favored them, coming through ceilings instead of doors. They adapted. And 3 years in, the most frightening question she could formulate was, how far along are they? She made herself put it away for later and went to make tea. That night, lying awake in the dark, listening to Daniel's breathing even out into sleep, she thought about something she had not allowed herself to think about directly in months. She thought about the signal. In the first year, there had been a network, not the old internet, that was gone in the first 3 months. The infrastructure too dependent on the digital systems the things disrupted, or the power grids they had taken down simply by occupying the sites near them. But there had been an analog network, shortwave radio, the old backbone, the kind of thing amateur radio enthusiasts had been building and maintaining for decades, for exactly the kind of situation where everything else stopped working. She had found a receiver in the apartment building across the street in the 4th month, brought it back, spent 2 days figuring out the power draw from the boiler's supplementary circuit. She had listened for 6 months. Most of it was silence or interference. Some of it was other survivors, fragmentary, mostly broadcasting into the void because broadcasting into the void was something to do. She had cataloged it all. Locations, frequencies, patterns. She had learned that there were more people alive than she had thought, scattered in pockets across the continent, doing what she and Daniel were doing, burning their own accounting of supplies and risks and weather against an enemy that was slowly, inexorably learning how to finish what it had started. And then, in the 9th month, she had heard the other signal. Not a voice, not a broadcast, a pattern of tones on a frequency she had not been monitoring, that she had stumbled into during a sweep. Short, regular, repeating on an 18-minute cycle. She had recorded it, transcribed it, spent 3 nights trying to decode it before she understood that it was not in code. It was a beacon, a location beacon, old format, the kind used by maritime vessels before GPS, broadcasting a set of coordinates. She had looked up the coordinates on a paper map. She had a full set, had prioritized paper maps over nearly everything else in the first weeks, and found that they resolved to a point 260 kilometers to the northwest. High ground, isolated. Not a city, not a military installation that she knew of. A point on a ridge in the Carpathian upland, accessible but not easily, off any main road by 30 kilometers of forest track. She had told Daniel about it in the 10th month. He had said, could be a trap. She had said, yes. He had said, could be nothing, a broken transmitter running on backup power, broadcasting to nobody. She had said, yes. He had, so what do you want to do? And she had said, I want to keep listening. She had kept listening. The beacon was still broadcasting. 18 months later, it was still there, same frequency, same cycle, same coordinates. A broken transmitter would have died by now. Power sources failed. Components degraded. A beacon that was still broadcasting after 18 months was being maintained. Someone was keeping it alive. She had not told Daniel yet that she thought they should go. She would tell him tomorrow, she thought. After the hardware store visit, after what had happened in the ceiling, after the word strategy had sat in the stairwell between them and neither of them had found a good answer for it. She would tell him that the gaps were not good news, that what was learning how to come through ceilings was not going to stop learning, that staying in one place was a different kind of dying, that 260 kilometers was a long way, but it had a known endpoint, and staying had no endpoint at all, just the diminishing margins of a calculation that was trending in one direction. She would tell him about the beacon. She fell asleep at 2 in the morning and dreamed about nothing, which was the best thing she could have dreamed about, and woke at 6 to the particular quality of light that meant clear sky and sunshine and the specific blue-white glare of fresh snow. And she lay still for a moment and listened to the building and the street and the world, which was cold and quiet and still, as far as she could tell, her world to move through for one more day. She got up, she made coffee, she went to the window. She scratched the 12th mark into the plaster beside it. Then she turned around and looked at Daniel, who was watching her from across the room with both hands around his mug and the careful, patient look of a man who had learned to wait for the thing she was about to say. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Okay." She sat down across from him. She put both hands flat on the table. 18 months ago, I found a signal, a beacon. It's still broadcasting." She told him the frequency. She told him the coordinates. She told him what she thought it meant, that it was still there after 18 months. He listened without speaking. He did not interrupt, did not ask questions, kept his face in the careful neutral that she had learned to read as attention rather than disengagement. When she finished, he looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up. "How far?" he said. 260 kilometers. In winter. Spring is 8 weeks away, maybe 6 if the trend holds. That's a lot of open ground, yes. A lot of exposure, yes. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window, at the clear sky, at the scratched marks beside it. "What happened yesterday?" he said slowly. "In the hardware store, yes. That's what changed your mind. That's what made me realize I needed to tell you. I've been thinking about it for longer." He was quiet again. A long quiet. She let it run. Outside, the sun had cleared the buildings to the east and was casting long shadows across the snow-covered street, precise and black and almost beautiful. "The beacon coordinates," he said finally. "Do they put it on high ground?" 300 meters above the valley floor, southeast face. Defensible, theoretically, and someone is keeping it powered, yes. So someone has power, in winter, for 18 months. He said it slowly, feeling the implications. That's not just survival, that's infrastructure. She had thought the same thing and had been almost afraid to think it. Yes, someone organized, he said, or several someones. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the scratch marks on the wall. Then at the bag of hardware supplies from the trip that had almost killed them. Then back at her. "We'd need to leave in 6 weeks, he said, maximum, before the thaw makes the eastern road sections impassable. I know, we'd need sleds, the cart won't make it over forest sections. I know. I've been thinking about it. The rifle won't be enough. We'd need more ammunition than we have, and we'd need to move quietly, which means we might need to go over the route twice in advance." "Daniel," he stopped. She looked at him. "Is that a yes?" He was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Ask me again in a week," he said. "Let me think about the route." He picked up his mug. "I want to look at your maps." 6 weeks later, on the 3rd of April, they left Vela. She had been methodical about it, in the way she was methodical about everything, making lists, checking them, making them again. What they could carry, what they would have to leave. The weight-to-need calculation that governed every choice. Food first, then ammunition, then the tools that had no substitutes, then the medical kit, then the small irreplaceable things that were not practical but were human. She allowed herself one book. She chose it carefully, spent 3 evenings going through the shelf before she settled on a battered copy of a collection of essays that her sister had given her the Christmas before everything ended, which she had not read then and had read 4 times since. She allowed Daniel one thing of his own choosing. He chose a photograph, which he folded into the front pocket of his pack without showing her, and she did not ask. They left at 4 in the morning, the town of Vela still and dark around them, the sky clear and cold above. She had been awake for an hour before the departure time, lying still with her eyes open in the dark, doing the last inventory in her head. Route, supplies, contingencies, the known positions of the beacon. She had listened to the building for the last time. She had run her hand along the crack in the east wall, the one that Daniel had never had time to properly fix, and thought, some other problem now, some other accounting. The sleds were loaded and covered and waiting at the ground floor entrance. She and Daniel worked in silence in the dark, with the practiced economy of people who had been moving quietly through bad spaces for 3 years, checking the loads, adjusting the harnesses, doing the final check of the weapons. She had the rifle. He had the bolt action and the short-barreled shotgun they had found in the police station in the 7th month, which was loud but devastating at close range. She had calculated that between the 2 of them, they had enough ammunition for 12 significant engagements, more if they were careful, fewer if things went badly. She had planned a route that avoided the town center and gave them forest cover for the first 20 kilometers, which was the section she was most worried about. They pulled the sleds out into the cold street. The last thing she did before they moved was look back at the building. 4 stories of 1970s brick, lit by nothing, its windows dark. She had lived in it for 2 years and 7 months. She had marked the walls with scratches, and lined the shelves with jars, and learned the creak of every floorboard and the specific sound the boiler made when it needed attention. She had been cold and frightened and sometimes almost peaceful in it, and she had been as alive in it as she knew how to be. She turned away from it and started walking. The first 8 kilometers went smoothly. They reached the forest road as the sky was going from black to a deep blue-gray, the specific pre-dawn that was neither dark nor light, and she navigated by the map she had memorized and the stars that were still faintly visible through the tree canopy overhead. The sleds moved well on the packed snow of the forest track, better than she had expected. The surface had frozen hard overnight, and the runners slid easily. The only sound was the breath of effort and the soft whisper of the runners, and, occasionally, the wind in the high branches. At the 12-kilometer mark, at the edge of the forest where the road crossed a ridge and the landscape opened up, she stopped them. "Wait," she said. She looked at the open ground ahead, 300 meters of bare hillside dropping away to a shallow valley, then another slope rising to the next forest section. No cover. She checked the sky. Clear, which meant good visibility in both directions, which was simultaneously good and bad. She stood and watched the open section for 5 minutes, scanning every part of it systematically, the near slope and the far slope and the tree line to the left and the ruined farmhouse she could see on the right. "We move fast," she said. "No stopping. If something appears, we do not stop to engage. We go for the far tree line. Understood? Understood. Stay close." They crossed the open section in 8 minutes. She counted her heartbeats without meaning to. They reached the far tree line, and she pulled them both into the shadow of the first large trees, and stopped and stood with her back against the bark, and her rifle up, and watched the slope they had just crossed. Empty. She let out the breath she had been holding. This was the pattern of the next 3 days. Sections of forest road where they could move in near silence, covering 12 to 15 kilometers a day on the good surface. 3 crossings of open ground, each one calculated and timed, and survived. 2 nights sheltered in structures she had identified in advance from the map. A forestry depot, whose lock took her 4 minutes to open. A concrete water management station, whose interior was cold but intact. Each night she did the full perimeter check before she allowed them to sleep. Each night she lay in the dark and listened to the specific sounds of whatever space they were in, cataloging and discarding, feeling for the thing that didn't belong. On the second, the thing that didn't belong arrived at 3 in the morning. She was awake before the sound resolved into anything she could identify. Some sub-threshold change in the acoustic texture of the dark, the way a room sounds different when the air pressure shifts. She was sitting up with the rifle in her hands before her conscious mind had processed what had changed, and then she heard it outside, on the roof of the forestry depot, the soft rhythmic sound of something moving over corrugated metal. Very slowly, very carefully, she reached across and woke Daniel. She signed him to the north wall. She took the south wall. The sounds stopped. She counted her breathing. In the silence, she could hear her own heartbeat and Daniel's careful, controlled exhales from across the room, and nothing else. She kept her eyes on the window. A small, high window, heavily frosted, which would give at most 2 seconds of warning if anything came through it. Her rifle was on the window. Her mind was on the roof hatch. The roof hatch was to her left. 8 steps. She had counted them when they came in. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. 3. The sound did not return. On the 4th minute, she heard something else. From outside, through the thick walls, muffled but distinct. A sound she had not heard before in 3 years of listening for things in the dark. It was low and complex and not quite like any sound she had a prior category for, not quite like an animal and not quite like a mechanism, something that had elements of both and was entirely neither. She thought, "It is communicating." The word strategy arrived again, and she drove it away and held the rifle and counted her breathing. On the 6th minute, the sound outside stopped. The quality of the silence changed. Not the held silence of something waiting, but the ordinary silence of absence. The difference she had learned to feel the way you learn to feel a change in weather. It had gone. She and Daniel stayed at the walls for another 40 minutes. Then she crossed to him and put her back against the wall beside him, and they both looked at the frosted window in the dark without speaking. 2 in 1 week, he said, subvocal, a breath barely shaped into words. Yes, following us, or coincidence. She didn't answer because she was thinking about what she had heard and what it meant that she had no prior category for the sound. The things were bipedal hunters with no evident social structure that any of the archived papers had documented. They moved independently, hunted independently, showed no coordination beyond the broad geographic pattern of their deployment in the first week. What she had heard had sounded like. She made herself form the word like a transmission, an exchange, something going out into the dark and expecting a reply. Not coincidence, she said finally. He was quiet. Then, how much farther? 80 kilometers. 2 days in good conditions. Then we move faster tomorrow. We move smarter tomorrow, she said. Not faster. Faster means mistakes. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly. Right, he said. Smarter. They were back on the road at 4. The next day was hard. The forest road deteriorated after the 40-kilometer mark. The surface had been broken up by freeze-thaw cycles she hadn't accounted for, and the sleds caught on the exposed roots and loose rock under the fractured snow. They lost 2 hours in the afternoon forcing a section she had marked as passable on the map that had become impassable sometime in the winter. She found the detour, an old logging access that added 3 kilometers but held solid surface, and they made it back to acceptable pace by late afternoon. She watched the trees. The trees were quiet. She couldn't decide if the quiet was reassuring or the other kind of quiet. She watched the upper branches, where something heavy moving fast would disturb the snow load. She watched the shadows between the trunks. She kept the rifle on her shoulder. At the 60-kilometer mark in the late afternoon of the third day, the terrain changed. The forest opened up into a section of clear cut that she hadn't anticipated. The map was 4 years old, and the logging had happened after the survey. She stopped at the edge of the clear cut and looked at it. 300 meters across, nothing taller than scrub and saplings, then the forest again beyond. The light was going. An hour of usable visibility, maybe less. She made the calculation in about 30 seconds. The forest was compromised. They had been heard in it, followed in it, and the sound she had heard in the forestry depot had not been an accident or a coincidence. The clear cut was exposed, but it was visible in both directions. If something was following them through the trees, the clear cut gave it no cover. The forest beyond the clear cut put them back in cover, but also put any pursuer in cover too. The ridge coordinates were another 20 kilometers beyond this point. They would need to night shelter again. We cross now, she said, before the light goes completely. Daniel looked at the clear cut and then at the darkening sky and then at her. Fast, smart, she said. Steady pace. No running. Running creates sound and compromises terrain reading. Okay. They crossed the clear cut in the fading light. She watched the tree lines on all sides as they moved, quartering the ground ahead and to the sides, keeping Daniel's position in her peripheral vision. The scrub snagged at the sled runners, and she freed them twice without stopping moving, working by feel. The far tree line came closer, 100 meters, 70, 50. At 30 meters, she heard the upper branches behind her, the specific concussive sound of something large launching itself from height, the snow falling from disturbed branches in a cascade behind them, the thud of significant weight landing on the open ground. She did not turn around. Run, she said. Forest now. They ran. She heard it behind them. Not footsteps exactly. Not the sound of something running in the way she understood running, but the ground saying weight landing, weight landing, weight landing in a rhythm that was faster than it should have been able to be. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the forest and she ran and she heard Daniel running beside her and she counted the meters in the trees. Came up and she plunged into them and turned left and pulled Daniel behind a tree trunk and brought the rifle up. It had stopped at the edge of the forest. She could see it in the last gray light, standing at the tree line, still, not coming in. It had followed them to the edge of the trees and then it had stopped. She held the rifle on it. It was not doing anything. It was standing in the open, at the border of the cleared ground and the trees, in a posture she had no category for, not the posture of a predator about to charge. Not the posture of something retreating, something else, something she had not seen before. Waiting, no, not waiting. She lowered the rifle half an inch, she looked at it. She thought about the sound in the forestry depot. She thought about the hole in the hardware store ceiling. She thought about the 34-day gaps and the longer gaps and the pattern of behavior that she had been calling strategy, and had not fully examined the implications of. It had followed them across open ground. It had been behind them, faster than them, and it had pulled up short of the trees. She thought, it chose to stop. Not because it couldn't follow, because it chose. She thought, Why would something that could outpace you choose to stop? And then, in a cold, clear wave, she understood. Not a predator. Something smarter than a predator. Something that understood the concept of a destination. It had been following them not to catch them, but to see where they were going. The breath left her body. She stood very still and looked at it, and it stood very still and looked at them, or whatever it used for looking, and for a long moment neither of them moved in the failing light. Then slowly it turned. It walked back across the clear cut. It reached the far tree line. It went into the tree and was gone. She didn't move for 3 full minutes. Then she lowered the rifle. Then she looked at Daniel, who was pressed against the tree next to her with his face doing something complicated. "Did it just?" he said. "Yes." It turned around. "Yes." He looked at the empty clear cut, then at her. "It wasn't hunting us," he said. "No." He was quiet for a long time. The dark came down around them and the cold settled and the forest was silent. Then, "Mara, what does that mean?" She thought about the beacon. 260 kilometers. The coordinates on the ridge. The organized infrastructure. The power source running for 18 months in winter. She thought about the things and how long they had been here, and how much they had learned and what direction that learning was traveling. She thought about strategy and about what came after strategy in the long arc of a species that had come 300,000 years from a grassland to a conference room in Brno. "I think," she said carefully, "that we're not the only ones who have thought of that ridge." Daniel looked at her. "I think," she continued, "that we are going to arrive at those coordinates and we are going to find something we didn't expect. And I think the question is whether the people already there have figured out what I just figured out. Which is," she looked out at the dark clear cut, at the empty space where the thing had been standing. "That the gap is not absence," she said. "It's never been absence. It's been patience. Waiting for us to show them where we go when we think we're safe." She paused. "And that the beacon has been broadcasting for 18 months. Which means whatever is on that ridge has been broadcasting for 18 months. And if we can hear it, so can they," Daniel said. "Yes." They stood together in the dark forest for a moment with that truth between them. The cold was deep and specific and she felt it in her lungs and her fingers and the bridge of her nose. She felt it in the way that cold at the edge of something dangerous felt. Clarifying, like the cold was burning off everything that wasn't essential and leaving only what mattered. She turned. She looked at him. 20 kilometers, she said. 14 hours of dark left. We move now. We arrive at dawn." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the sled harness. "Show me the route," he said. She showed him the route. They moved through the night. What she remembered of those 14 hours later, when there was a later and she could remember things without it costing her too much. The cold. Not the discomfort of it, but the presence of it. The way it became a companion after the first few hours, reliable and absolute. The specific quality of the stars through the trees, which were out in full now, the Milky Way a brushstroke overhead. Daniel's breathing behind her, steady, metronomic, the sound of someone who had decided to commit and was committed, the sound of the runners, the map in her head. 2 incidents. The first, at the 2-hour mark, was a sound in the trees to the east that she stopped for and listened to for 3 minutes and decided was structural. A branch under snow load, the crack and thud of it falling that was just a branch under snow load and nothing else. The second, at the 6-hour mark, was harder to categorize, a change in the air, a brief shift in smell and temperature that she had learned to associate with proximity, and she stopped them, and they were absolutely still for 8 minutes and nothing came, and then she could not find the change anymore, and she decided to keep moving. They were learning the same thing she was. That was the thought she kept returning to in the long dark hours. Both sides building the same picture, one piece at a time. The things learning human behavior, movement patterns, shelter preferences, the geography of human decision-making. Humans learning, she was learning the things' behavior, their gaps and patterns. The thing that drove them and the thing they did not do. The thing that had stopped at the tree line and turned back. The thing that had chosen. She thought about what it meant to choose, what it implied. What came before choice in the long evolutionary sequence? Sensation, then learning, then memory, then abstraction, then the capacity to model futures. The capacity to decide that this future was better than that one. She thought about the 3 years of increasingly sophisticated behavior, the learning that was too fast for individual adaptation, that had to be something shared, some mechanism of collective update she couldn't name. She thought about communication, the sound she had heard, the exchange going out into the dark expecting a reply. She thought about the ships, still up there, still present after 3 years, visible on clear nights as a particular kind of motionless darkness against the stars. They were not finished. That had been the most frightening thought in 3 years, the one she had built the highest walls around. They were not finished. They had deployed the things and retreated to observation, and the things had been learning, and somewhere on those ships the information from the things was being received and assessed, and at some point in the calculation, when the learning was far enough along, when the map of human behavior was complete enough, there would be a next phase. She did not know what the next phase was. She did not want to know yet. She kept walking. They reached the ridge at 5:47 in the morning. She knew it by the terrain, the specific rise and turn that matched her mental map, the face of the ridgeline becoming visible in the pre-dawn as a dark shape against a slightly lighter sky. She stopped them 300 meters from the crest and spent 20 minutes watching the ridge, watching the sky above it, watching the approaches from east and west before she moved. At 200 meters she could see the structure, or part of it, what appeared to be a building, low profile, built into the ridge face rather than standing on it, a technique that reduced visible profile and heat signature. Good thinking, careful thinking. Someone had planned this well. At 100 meters she could see the antenna, a simple vertical with a folded dipole, old design, low power, the kind of antenna that put out exactly enough signal to be received, but not enough to be distinctive at long range. She recognized the design because she had looked it up. In the months when she was still trying to decode the signal, she had looked up the antenna design for exactly this emission profile. 70 meters, she slowed. Her rifle was up, not aimed, but up, 50 meters. She stopped, she stood still, and she waited. At 45 meters the door opened. The figure that came out was not what she had expected and was also exactly what she had expected. A woman, 40, maybe, or older. The kind of age that was hard to read on faces that had been through what these faces had been through. She was wearing layers, practical, insulated, well-chosen. She was carrying a rifle with the easy hold of someone who had been carrying one for a long time. She stopped in the doorway and looked at them. Behind her, Mara could hear voices, multiple voices, at least 4, maybe 6. The woman in the doorway looked at Mara for a moment, then at Daniel, then back at Mara. "You came from the south," the woman said. Her voice was accented, Eastern, maybe Romanian. Mara couldn't be certain. "We've been watching the approaches for 2 weeks. The beacon," Mara said. "You heard it. 18 months ago. I waited until I understood why I should wait." She kept the rifle in the easy position. "One of them followed us last night, to the edge of the clear-cut at the 30-kilometer mark. Then it turned back." The woman's expression didn't change much, but something in it shifted, a micro-movement of the eyes. 30-kilometer mark, she said slowly. It stopped at the tree line and turned around. It wasn't hunting us. The woman looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned her head and said something into the building behind her in rapid Romanian. A pause. Then a response from inside, also Romanian, from a voice that was male and older. The woman turned back. "Come inside," she said. "We've been waiting for someone who understood that part." Mara lowered the rifle fully. She looked at Daniel. He looked at her. "Okay," he said. It was not a question. She walked the last 40 meters. Inside, the structure was warmer than she had expected and more organized than she had dared hope. The main space was large. They had built it into the ridge from an existing cave system. She saw the natural stone of the hillside forming the back and side walls, constructed walls closing the front. There were 8 people, a mix of ages, nationalities. She heard at least 3 languages in the first minute. A man who appeared to be in his 60s and who carried himself as if he had been in command of something, once, and still was. A teenage boy who was operating a radio set with the absorbed concentration of someone who had been doing it for a long time. 3 women of varying ages, all of whom showed the specific kind of competence in small routine gestures that came from sustained high-stakes living. A man with a prosthetic lower leg who was, Mara noted, doing something careful and precise at a workbench in the far corner. On the wall was a map. Not a paper map, a composite of paper maps, dozens of them, pinned together into a mosaic 3 meters wide, covered in notations in multiple colors of ink. She went to it and stood in front of it. The notations were encounter records, dates, locations, behavioral observations. Her eyes moved over them quickly. Someone had been tracking the thing's behavior for a long time. Someone had been building, carefully, the same picture she had been building, the same analysis, but in more detail, with more data points. She found the clear cut at the 30-kilometer mark. There was already a notation there, in red ink, with a date 2 months prior. Observed pursuit termination without engagement. Question mark. She turned around. The older man was watching her. "You've seen it before," she said. The voluntary stopping. 12 times, he said. His accent was heavier than the woman's. Check, possibly. In 6 different geographic areas. Always at a boundary. Forest to open ground, urban to rural. Always termination of pursuit at the line. Always the same type of boundary? No. Different types. The boundary itself doesn't appear to be the variable. He looked at her carefully. What is the variable in your analysis? She looked at the map again. She looked at the dense network of notation, the 12 red incidents. She thought about the sound she had heard in the depot, the hole in the ceiling, the long gaps, the thing standing at the tree line. Observation, she said. The variable is whether they have observed the destination. She paused. They stop because they already know where we're going. They stop because following further adds no new information. The room was very quiet. We reached that conclusion last week, the older man said. After the 12th incident. He looked at her for a moment longer. Sit down. We have a great deal to discuss. She sat. They talked for 11 hours. She was not accustomed to talking for 11 hours, had not talked that much or that intensely since the before time, and the sensation of it was strange and vivid, the specific exhaustion of extended thought, the way the brain felt after sustained effort, in the way the body felt after sustained physical work. She shared everything she knew. They shared everything they knew. They were not a military operation, not a government remnant, not an NGO. They were what she and Daniel were. Survivors with particular skills who had kept doing the work. A structural engineer who had also been a radio amateur. A doctor. Someone who had worked in zoology. Someone else who had worked in psychology and was the one who had first noticed the behavioral shift in the things. Encounter pattern, who had been the first to say, the gaps are not retreating. The gaps are something else. By evening, Mara had a different picture. A better one. Harder in some ways because better pictures of hard situations were still pictures of hard situations. But better because it was more complete, because it had more hands on it. The things were not finished. They had not decided to let humanity alone in the pockets and folds of a ruined continent. They were in a phase of learning, building a map of human behavior and human shelter patterns and human decision-making. And when the map was sufficient, when they knew where every Vela was and who was likely to flee and where they were likely to flee to, the next phase would begin. The question was what the next phase was, and the other question, the one the zoologist had been working on for 6 months, the one that the radio amateur had been building toward with a second antenna array he was installing above the ridge, was whether the thing's capacity for learning and for what looked like communication was something that could be reached. Whether there was, at sufficient complexity, a thing that was not hunting and not strategy, but something further along. Whether the gap between hunter and strategist was as large as the gap between strategist and interlocutor. You're talking about contact, Mara said. I'm talking about understanding what we're actually dealing with, the zoologist said. He was the youngest of them, pale and intense, with the look of someone who had not slept adequately in months. 3 years in, and we're still running. Every decision we make is reactive. We're responding to a behavior we don't fully understand, with a model that is 8 months out of date the day we complete it. You want to change the variable, she said. I want to know what the variable is. She thought about the thing at the tree line. She thought about what it had chosen and why. She thought about the capacity for choice, what it implied, where it led. The 12 voluntary stops, she said. In your documentation, is there any evidence of what came next, after the stop? Where did they go? The older man looked at her. That's what we've been trying to determine, he said quietly. In 7 of the 12 cases, we have no subsequent data. The observers weren't in a position to follow. He paused. In 5 cases, we have data. Another pause. In all 5 cases, the thing that stopped went to the same location. She looked at him. The same location, she said. The same location, he confirmed. Not the same geographic location, the same type of location. High ground, visibility in all directions, isolated. He looked at the map on the wall, at all the color-coded notation. The same type of location, he said again, as this one. Mara turned and looked at the map. She looked at the antenna. She looked at the radio set where the boy was still monitoring, patient and steady. She looked at the notation by the 30-kilometer mark, the red question mark. They know we're here, she said. Yes, the older man said. They've known for some time. That's not why we're still here. She looked at him. We're still here, he said, because they have not come. For 11 months they have known this location, and they have not come. And I believe, I cannot prove this, the evidence is circumstantial. The model is incomplete. But I believe that the reason they have not come is connected to the same reason they stopped following 11 times before, and came to a location like this one. I believe they are trying to determine what we do here, what this is. The radio set crackled. The boy adjusted a dial, made a note, adjusted again. Mara stood very still and looked at the map and felt the thing she was feeling, which was not hope exactly, but was in the same family as hope, a cold, careful, specific thing that she did not trust entirely but would not put down. Then we show them, she said. The room was quiet. We show them what this is, she said. Not by broadcast, not by signal, by continuing to do it. She looked around at all of them. They are building a map of human behavior. We can put something on that map that they haven't cataloged yet. Not fleeing, not sheltering, not hunting for survival. She paused, building. The zoologist looked at her. Something moved in his face. They have mapped what we do when we're afraid, she said. When we run, when we hide, when we fight. They have not seen what we do when we decide to stop running. She looked at the old man. Have they? He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the map. No, he said, they have not. Outside, the stars were coming out over the ridge. Through the narrow window set into the stone wall, Mara could see the particular scatter of them above the dark line of the tree line. The same stars that had been overhead all winter. The same stars her father had named for her in the garden of a house that no longer existed. Orion was rising. She could see the belt of it. 3 points of light steady and clear. She thought about 3 years of scratches and plaster. 3 years of accounting, of margins, of the cold arithmetic of survival. 3 years of doing what had to be done and nothing else, because there was only ever time for what had to be done. She thought about the thing at the tree line, choosing to stop. She thought about the gap, and what lived in the gap, and whether what lived there was only patience. She turned back to the room. 8 people looking at her. Daniel beside her, his hand briefly touching hers, a thing she did not acknowledge but that she felt. Tell me what you've built so far, she said, and tell me what you need. The old man nodded once. He went to the wall and put his hand on the map. It started with the antenna, he said, and then we needed the power source, and then we needed a theory. You have the theory now, she said. We have a theory. Then we build the rest. She looked at the map, all the color-coded dots and lines and questions, the 11 months of work, the patient accumulation of data by people who had decided to understand rather than simply survive. We build it carefully, we build it right, and we let them watch us do it. She picked up the marker from the table. She made a new mark on the map, not a record of an encounter, not a date and a location and a question mark, a point, a starting place. She looked at it, she put the marker down, outside, on the ridge above the antenna, on the high ground where visibility ran in all directions and the stars were very bright and the cold was clean and the gap between the last thing and the next thing was neither absence nor patience but possibility. Outside, the wind moved across the snow and the night was still, and the work, the real work, the work that was nothing like fleeing and nothing like hiding, was about to begin. She had a pencil, she had a map, she had 8 people who had kept faith with the hardest kind of intelligence, the kind that went on working when working felt absurd. She had, against all reasonable calculation, a theory. She exhaled, she rolled up her sleeves. She got to work.